Hi, folks. Thanks for being here. This is the ibogaine conversation panel. The title of this panel is Ibogaine Safety and Pros, Cons of Medicalization. We might also go deeper than that into other nuances, as ibogaine is a very complex subject, and iboga, which is the plant that it comes from. So first, maybe each of you can give a real brief intro of yourselves, the two-sentence version of your bios, so folks have a little bit of context for who everyone is here.
Okay. Hi, my name is Patrick Kroupa. I was a very high-functioning addict during the 90s. I had access to significant resources at the time. I tried every conceivable detox to get off of heroin, and absolutely nothing worked for me. Ibogaine did work for me, and that was sort of my beginning of this very long story that's now spanned 2 decades at this point, working with individuals trying to get off drugs, utilizing ibogaine.
My name's Jeremy Weate, and I guess I had a bit of a loss of meaning in my life about 4 years ago, and iboga sort of turned up as something that would structure my life with meaning. I don't have a substance abuse history, but the last 4 or 5 years I've been completely immersed in ibogaine and iboga. I'm working on a film project about ibogaine. I am Executive Director of the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance, and I've just moved to Portugal to run a ibogaine clinic.
Hi, my name is Natalie Ginsberg, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and we conduct some observational research with ibogaine, but really as doing policy work, I'm engaging more and more around ibogaine, both in the US and internationally. And also, I guess a bit before I came to MAPS, I was working as a social worker, and so I bring a lot of that mindset into my work with policy, especially with ibogaine.
Hi, my name is Tobias Erny. I work with ibogaine since 2006, where I got detoxed myself, and then it spread into the friend circles, and I got really interested into the topic, and finally was asked to write a book about ibogaine, which is now published in German, and organized together with Jeremy the European Ibogaine Forum, and work with ibogaine in and around Europe. Thank you.
And I'm Mike Margolies. I'm not an ibogaine expert. I'm formerly co-director of Symposia, where in this past December we ran a series of articles kind of going into the nuances of iboga and ibogaine. And I personally learned a lot during that experience. I attended the forum in Vienna, and so I came in as a newcomer to this scene, and with a lot of questions. And so coming off of that, I wanted to bring some of the questions that we raised in that series to this panel here. And to start off, none of us are experts in this particular subject per se, but I want to start by acknowledging, ibogaine, of course, comes from iboga, which is the plant that grows in West Central Africa, in Gabon and Cameroon. Maybe some folks here could give us a little bit of context on Weate, or Jeremy maybe is the person who is the most experienced in that sense. But obviously, to whatever extent you feel comfortable sharing, obviously none of us here are
What do you want to so far?
just to give a context of the iboga and.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, there's a lot that's not known about that story. So, you start to do a little bit of internet research, and you might quickly find out about Weate, B-W-I-T-I, or sometimes spelled B-W-E-T-E, Weate. And it's a long, very complex story. We know about the ethnic group, the Fang, who are Bantu origin people who came upon iboga maybe 200 years ago, not so long ago really, and they came upon it in the area we now call Gabon, and some of the area we now call Cameroon, and also a little bit of Central African Republic, and a little bit of Congo, Brazzaville. So the Congo Basin area is where the Tabernanthe iboga tree is distributed. It's interesting because it sort of looks like the Tabernanthe iboga tree is what's called an endemic species. In other words, it doesn't really like growing elsewhere. It's quite fragile and fussy about the climate and so on. Indeed, I saw a iboga tree on the west coast of Mexico recently, and it had basically reached 3 or 4 feet in height and stopped growing, no matter the love and attention given to it. So there's something very indigenous and native about Tabernanthe iboga in the Congo Basin region. Anyway, the original users in a sacramental context of iboga were the pygmies in that area. And this is the point that we don't really know anything about pygmy use of iboga. We really do not know anything. There's been no research because it's really, really almost impossible to do that level of research. There's a good friend of mine who is obsessed with this topic. It's likely that the pygmies have used iboga for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. It's likely that iboga is one of the first, if not the first, sacramental substances used. It's likely that there are still pygmy groups using iboga, but it's impossible for researchers to penetrate. They will not allow researchers to come in. And my friend was just telling me a couple of weeks ago that there are pygmy groups in Central African Republic, but again, they will not allow outsiders, researchers, anthropologists, whoever to come in. So there's a big mystery around what sacramental ritual elements were used originally around iboga, but what we do know a lot about, and which has been quite studied by anthropologists, is the Weate Fong version. And that's, I have no expertise in that. I went to Gabon, I was initiated, but that really means diddly squat. Weate is not book knowledge. I mean, the books that are written about Weate don't amount to an approximation of what Weate is. Weate is an embodied practice. It's a set of oral narratives that you learn across time. It's not something that if you read up on the internet or read some of the anthropological material, you can ever consider yourself to be an expert. Maybe just, I don't know, should I stop there or?
Yeah.
I don't want to hog the conversation. My experience in Gabon, just very briefly, was a 10-day ceremony. Westerners often gravitate towards a wizened old Frenchman called Tobias, and I went to his place near Libreville. And it consisted of a baptism and various preparatory ceremonies and rituals before the iboga ceremony, and it was a pretty full-on experience.
Thanks. And of course, all of us sitting here are Westerners, and the Western interest in iboga, as some of you may know, it came about when Howard Letzoff sort of serendipitously discovered that ibogaine interrupted his heroin withdrawal symptoms. He came out, and correct me if I'm getting the story wrong at all, but he had a heroin addiction and he had this ibogaine experience and came out on the other side, no longer craving, no longer having withdrawal, and then the story went from there. I just think it was important for us to, as limited knowledge as we have and can speak to Weate or even the further back traditions, understanding that there is a tradition that goes deeper than just using ibogaine, that single alkaloid for addiction. And I think it's important, and also to acknowledge the little that we know, because I think as we're talking about medicalizing ibogaine, we'd be remiss not to lean a little bit on some wisdom that's already there for working with iboga. Iboga, did you have something you want to say, Natalie? Okay. So ibogaine and iboga, they have this unique property that can help, particularly with opioid addiction. And feel free anyone to jump in if you want to chime in here. But also there's safety issues around it, where unlike other psychedelics like LSD, mushrooms, there actually are reports of people dying associated with ibogaine, oftentimes with complications. Do you guys want to speak to some of the risks of ibogaine?
Yeah, ibogaine is unlike most other entheogenic compounds in the sense that The outcome is not necessarily determined by setting, intent, your guide, or what you want to accomplish. And if something bad happens, it doesn't mean that you have a bad trip. Its potential physical side effects are considerable. There's, bradycardia, there's arrhythmias, there's QT prolongation. What constitutes an effective therapeutic dose versus what constitutes a potentially lethal dose is a relatively narrow window. It can kill you, like dead and stuff. You can basically take this molecule, and if you do not have medical supervision and you have pre-existing health issues which you are unaware of or you've chosen to disregard, there's a potentially fatal consequences, and there are a lot of adverse events that can occur. I work with Ibogaine I'm a consultant for Clear Sky Recovery, which is the oldest and largest Ibogaine treatment center that's existed for a very long time. And we basically are in the medical tourism industry, and there are very heavy health protocols, medical prerequisites that have to occur before taking it. It's not like come here and trip on Ibogaine. In fact, we do not do psychospiritual work at all. We only do the reboot to get drug-dependent individuals off of the drugs that they are addicted to. So the very short version, Ibogaine can be very dangerous to use, unlike most other entheogens.
Yeah, and so, you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a quick question related to that. Maybe you can speak to. In just getting, so it works with the addiction or like the physiological dependence, but how much of healing or reducing the physiological dependence is reliant upon processing the existing traumas or experiences from childhood or emotional dysregulation that leads to the addiction?
The answer to that is none whatsoever. Basically, that can have a lot to do with maintaining your sobriety. The reboot and maintaining sobriety don't have that much to do with one another. You need to engage in some sort of aftercare, which is really critical if you want to maintain. But really, you dose Ibogaine. I mean, the first time I did it, I was on 200 mgs of methadone, and I was doing about a gram and a half of heroin on top of that. And within roughly 30 to 45 minutes, you are going from a state of withdrawal where you're experiencing just significant pain, and it's like being suspended in this field of warm energy. There's like a feeling of like a snake, something like that. It's coiling up your spine, and very slowly all the pain is letting go, and it's just like drifting away from you, and your habit is gone. And your drug dependence is reset before you even start to trip. So that part of it works within 30 to 45 minutes, but the entire Ibogaine experience can last for 8, 12, 15 hours, depending on how much you did and how fast or slow you metabolize it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going back to the questions about dangers. I know, for example, methadone use, I've heard is like incomparable levels of people actually die from methadone use as from Ibogaine use, and methadone is a quite accepted way of treating problematic opiate use. So I was actually curious if you might be able to say a bit more about that, if you know.
I just know that in Germany, the methadone death case percentage is higher than Ibogaine, actually. But more I don't have to say on this topic.
Yeah, well, so to kind of tether some of these points you're pulling together, Ibogaine is of real interest because of this profound effect it has. You have severe opioid addiction, you take it, and 45 minutes later, okay, great, you're good. Together with potential safety issues, there's a driver there for medicalization. But as kind of Patrick was just alluding to, so you get this reset, great, but then there's more work to be done from that. There's integration. If you were to just go back in the exact same life circumstance, and Natalie can probably speak to some of this, you would go back into, if you don't resolve some of those traumas, you'll go back into similar habits. And so this brings up the question of, this isn't, and with psychedelics more broadly too, it's not so simple as just take this pill and it fixes your problems. There's broader work to be done around it. So I guess I'd maybe want to offer this as a question to the panelists here, and maybe Natalie, you want to comment on, what else do we need besides medicalization for actually something to be effective here?
Yeah, I think integration and the aftercare is really essential, and really excited to see the development of kind of peer support networks of integration after ibogaine experiences, because I've heard really terrible anecdotes. Like one person came back from an ibogaine experience, stopped using his pharmaceuticals, was in a really great place, met with a psychiatrist who said, this is manic euphoria, you need to go back on all of your pills, and just really wasn't able to support the healing process that was unfolding. So not only is it important to have peers to speak to, but also to have support from treatment centers that often do not in any way understand the new process. So I think that's something I'm hearing working at MAPS. A lot of the issues are in the after effect and being able to sustain results and to integrate your experiences into your life when you return to a community or to situations that might be triggering as well.
I'm only just starting to work at a clinic, so it's early days for me, but what I've learned from talking in depth to the other people I'm working alongside is it's sort of a slight disagreement with you, Patrick, maybe, which is that intentionality is key to recovery, I think. So, for instance, there's a therapist partner that we're working with at our clinic. He was a crack addict for many years. And when he went through his ibogaine experience, well, first of all, he was refused treatment because the pre-treatment therapist was saying, you're not ready. So he now went to live in the woods in Sweden for 3 months and worked on himself, and he felt he was really ready then. And then he took his ibogaine, and he's been in recovery ever since. So I don't know. I can't speak of experience. I'm only just starting to work at this clinic, but I'd say I'd go along with that story that, and it sort of supports a little bit of what you were saying, Dana, which is that the experiential or phenomenological or narrative aspects of the iboga or ibogaine experience are just as important as the pharmacodynamic aspects. In other words, the experiential aspects of iboga are not epiphenomenon. They're not after effects that are sort of nice to have. Whether you have visions or not is nice to have. It seems to me, from synthesizing what people I listen to and respect say, that intentionality and experience are key.
Yeah, just to agree with you completely, intentionality is key to maintaining your sobriety. What I meant by what I said before is it's completely irrelevant in terms of when you do it. The reset will occur regardless. In terms of maintaining sobriety, I personally went through so many rehabs, and I was completely burnt out by them. And it actually took two ibogaines for me to stay clean. After the first one, I actually was checked into an aftercare facility, and it did not work out for me. I relapsed almost immediately, and after the second time, it did. But the thing is, with addiction, what does that mean? What is aftercare? It was 2002 or 2003, Hattie Wells and I submitted a paper that was published by MAPS in terms of ibogaine treatment outcomes. And I was working in underground settings at the time in the United States, where ibogaine is a Schedule I substance, and she was working in the UK at a time when it was legal. And across the board, the outcome was significantly better for people who engaged in some form of aftercare, whatever that means for you. If you have money and can avail yourself of all these different things, or if you're broke and you just do whatever you can, you need to change who you associate with, what you do. You need to establish different patterns in your life. And that very old saying, if you think you can do it or you think you can't do it, either way, you're right. I mean, if you believe, then you make it so, and you can maintain your sobriety, and you do not need to pick up an imaginary disease or go to, join a cult that says you're diseased and flawed and powerless forever. That's entirely optional. You can just say, maybe I just won't do drugs and I'll do something else. What ended up working for me was just realizing that nothing is working for me in the United States, and I went and I lived in an ashram in Thailand for 3 months. It was really beautiful, and it worked out for me.
Yeah, and I want to build off. Is this on? Text. All right, there we go. I want to build off of that. So the importance of aftercare and making life changes, but what do we do about a situation? Let's think about where addiction hits the hardest, and in certain vulnerable parts of our population that don't necessarily have the ability to make these changes that need to be. They're structural problems. And this is concerning. One of the concerns to me about touting ibogaine as a cure for addiction, right? Because you could give all the ibogaine you want, but ultimately, if someone's using a painkiller, right? So why the pain? And if we're not addressing the broader issues, I don't necessarily see ibogaine as helping anything unless we address as far as broader issues of addiction in our culture without addressing structural, deeper issues. Anyone like? Would anyone like to speak onto that? And maybe Natalie, would, I feel like you might have some thoughts around.
Sure, I definitely agree. And I guess to kind of bring that back into the kind of medicalization question, for me, when we look at the medicalization of other substances and who has access and who that helps, and the kind of for-profit models of treatment, I do definitely have concerns about how moving forward that would impact, ibogaine if someone were to develop it in a pharmaceutical setting, which there's also, I will say, a great need and something MAPS is definitely considering, because right now, doctors, at least in the United States where I'm based, rely on clinical research to prescribe medication, and clinical research is almost entirely funded by pharmaceutical companies or nonprofits like MAPS, but that's more rare. So I do see structurally a lot of systems in place that are keeping both people from accessing medicine, but also even that make it harder to do research on substances like ibogaine that could be effective in one experience, and perhaps aftercare, but there isn't, again, as much profit incentive as something that you would take every day, and the models that we have for treatment are not structures that really support research with psychedelics, and certainly with ibogaine and iboga, which are really unique treatment, require very unique treatment approaches.
Yeah, so you have something that?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of access, we're setting up this clinic, and the cheapest you can come to our clinic at the moment is going to be €3,500, and you share a room. I know Clear Sky charges more than that, but it's because Clear Sky has a medical doctor and a whole medical team, and cost of running this thing in Cancun and so on. And it's a similar situation for us. We would love to make it cheaper than that, but it's not. And we are getting a bunch of requests, and people simply can't afford even the €3,500 just to come for a week. And there's nothing we can do about it, because we could not run a business if it was cheaper than that. We would simply not break even. So, I don't know how the kind of, I do, in my sort of dark nights, I wonder, look, what are we really doing here? Because it is always going to be a niche treatment option, even if it medicalizes. Unless there's some kind of government subsidy, or in the case of places with privatized healthcare like the States, then eventually it'll be the part of the insurance package. But I guess in places like the UK where I'm from, €3,500, €5,000 £5,000 is not that much money for a treatment compared to cancer treatment and so on. But yeah, we're still facing the fact that we're like medicalization is not even, if you think about medicalization from the context of what's happening at the moment, you already have a medicalization process in play to an extent in New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada. But medicalization is not the end goal. It has to be part of a government policy, and there has to either be subsidized treatment or there has to be some kind of government policy program. So you don't have that in those three countries. In Canada, you have like a case-by-case treatment option, which sort of hasn't resulted in a single person taking ibogaine in Canada at the moment. In South Africa, it's a little bit more laissez-faire, so it's possible to have, and it's actually cheaper to take ibogaine in South Africa. But again, it's not even scratching the surface of the addiction problem. So, yeah, looking at addiction from a non-individualistic, from a social perspective, and the social collective causes of addiction, you realize that ibogaine is not. It's like a tiny tool in a much bigger picture.
Yes, I'd also like to speak in terms of access about that many of the people that I come into contact with who've been able to access treatment are white and often men, people who feel, I guess, safe enough, who maybe are able to afford it. And when we think about the populations most impacted by, certainly white men are also very impacted by addiction, but thinking about that structurally as well, and the many reasons that others are not able to access it.
So at least all right. I don't know why this keeps muting. So maybe this battery's done. So for the question of access, so there's this really high cost to providing an ibogaine treatment properly. On the underground, was this seen as well, or were folks like Howard or say Dimitri, that have been working, have they been able to provide access without these expensive costs? And what differences are we seeing here?
How much did Howard?
Well, towards the end of days, it was $35K, but it was in a hospital in Panama with an entire hospital wing wrapped around you, and as you can imagine, that was accessible only to very high net worth individuals. I was an underground treatment provider for about 8 years, and quite honestly, the reason I got into it is because I had a lot of friends who simply did not have a hope in hell of ever coming up with $5K or $10K or any amount like that to clean up off drugs. And they were my friends and they were suffering. And it was like, well, I have this magic wand and it can help you. And again, not to revolve in a circle, because we published this in a MAPS paper. It was like the one 2002, 2003, and essentially spread across a decade of time, I probably made negative $5,000 working with ibogaine and underground treatment of milieu. There's people who could not even afford the medication itself, so I ended up giving it away to them, and just here it is. Did it help them? Oddly enough, people who had to work to get some sort of lump sum of money together, whether that meant $1,000 for them or $800 for them, the ones who had to work for it seem to appreciate it more, take it more seriously, and engage in some form of aftercare and maintain their sobriety. Medical costs are considerable because you have all these people revolving around you. I'm not going to address what different people have done in the underground, because if you look at various news stories, see who got arrested for what, when, and how much money they were charging for that, the prices were pretty significant, considering it's a hotel room and here's some pills in a hotel room and there's no doctors. So it's debatable whether the underground is making more or less money than, medically based clinic. The main problem is people who are disenfranchised, who are not part of the system, who are disconnected, their problem is usually not drug dependence. That's their solution. Their problem is they have no marketable skills. They have no coping mechanisms for dealing with life sober. They lack almost everything they need. There has to be some sort of framework established that helps people reintegrate and move onwards with their lives after Ibogaine.
Just another thing on the aftercare that I'm already experiencing starting up this clinic is codependency is a humongous issue. So, for instance, we have one client who's coming, and he's the oldest son in the family, and the successful younger son is paying for his treatment. And there's a whole morass of interpersonal family dynamics going on with that situation. And you often find, I would say, that you have families where, you know, the black sheep being the addict is actually convenient for the rest of the family because the rest of the family feel all shiny and whole. And then, you know, you're threatening to change that situation, and that kind of throws the shadows back on the rest of the family. So, you know, another structural aspect of addiction is that it does involve networks of relations with friends and family and so on, which get recalibrated through this experience, and that recalibration process is itself problematic and difficult. So, you know, the addict gets rebooted, they go back home, and if they go back home too soon, then the judgmental sort of negative reactionary behavior, you spent all that money, you went to that clinic, and look at you now, you're still the same. All of that stuff, that unconscious behavior, that negative stuff will still come back. So you actually, the thing that I think we're going to find in our clinic really difficult is just dealing with family members and their relationship to the addiction in their sibling or their son or their daughter or whatnot.
And so I'm going to ask one more question, then maybe get some more from the audience. Actually, Toby, you haven't said much. So before this, we had exchanged some emails talking about other potential pitfalls of medicalization and where it can have unintended consequences. Maybe you can speak to this a little bit.
Well, there is this thing, I don't know if it's confirmed, I just heard about it gossip-wise, that people in a certain country are about to medicalize it, but in the process of doing so, they kind of also want to monopolize it. Basically, not having lay practitioners or having the people access it, so that they I don't know. I don't really, it's just the concept. I don't want to talk any names or whatever, but basically this is what could be a pitfall of medicalization, that the poorer guys, like the average addict is not a really rich person, so that these guys also could go and just purchase somewhere and have a manual on how to do it as safely as possible, would help a much broader audience than just having these super fancy clinics.
Just to agree with that specific aspect, I'm coming at things from a harm reduction perspective. So in terms of underground treatments, is Ibogaine perfectly safe? No, it's not. On the other hand, you have to balance that against what are the actions that any given individual is taking on a daily basis. I mean, you're banging shit into your veins that you cop up some guy standing on a street corner. Now, that might not be suicidal, but it's certainly very self-destructive, or it's addiction. You're not living a very healthy lifestyle. So weighing the pros and cons of your specific situation, and is it worthwhile to obtain Ibogaine in an underground setting, or just order it online, which has always been possible since the fucking 1990s, and that one's not going away. And without isolating any particular company, there's a lot of them. You always have the ability to avail yourself of the internet, the dark net, and just read, educate yourself to the best of your ability to do so, and then make your own choices, because it's your body, it's your life, and it's your unique situation.
That's a real issue. It's a real issue with. It's so easy to buy iboga online. And so on the one hand, you want to say, okay, well, people that are doing that, and we don't know how many people die from iboga online sales. It's not recorded, it's not captured. There's probably no post-mortem, which is finding out the ibogaine in the system. So on the one hand, you want to say, okay, so maybe what we should do is provide guidelines for safe, online DIY administration of ibogaine. But
It exists.
yeah, you can even.
The ibogaine manual from Howard.
Yeah, but the extent to which, like from a kind of official capacity, you do that is also the extent to which you're tantamount to legitimizing DIY administration, and DIY administration of ibogaine is never a good thing. So there's a real problem there about, the other problem from a Gita perspective is, there's many thousands of people that eventually find out about ibogaine, and they have an addiction issue, and they think, okay, let me go and take ibogaine. Like, what the heck do you do next? And I really feel for people, because you go online and there's just so much information, so much of it is wrong, and then eventually you wheedle your way to finding out about clinics. It's then, how do I find out about a clinic? And with my Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance hat on, Gita has never wanted to have a list of approved clinics because of the kind of obvious legal implications of being seen to be recommending a clinic in the case of an adverse event. So there isn't an authoritative guide to where you should go and who to trust. So it's pot luck if you're an addict, if you end up going to a safe clinic like Clear Sky, or you go some other place with some random lone wolf provider who doesn't really know what they're doing.
I actually have a question for you guys around the safety with titrated smaller doses of iboga and ibogaine that I've heard can be effective in stopping withdrawal symptoms, at least, and I imagine is much safer and maybe easier to integrate. And I'm yeah.
I will pass the mic back to you in a moment. That was actually the second MAPS paper. This is from 2004. I started to experiment with microdosing ibogaine, and the reason I did that was because it's extraordinarily stressful working with ibogaine in an underground setting. It's like, not only, are you lacking full medical supervision. It's like, okay, I have a defib, I have a heart monitor, I know what I'm doing. I am not going to run away and call 911. I will do my best to make sure you do not fucking die. But the stress is very real, because you're committing felonies while you're helping treat people. So it's like, okay, well, microdosing helped me when I was suffering from cravings after my floods. I would, suddenly just wake up, I want to go do dope. That's all I could think about today. I got to go do heroin. But doing a very small dose of ibogaine, say, 50 mgs, 100 mgs, I did that, and all of a sudden, oh, hey, the whole world has changed. All the cravings went away, and I stopped worrying about it so much. Maybe I'll just go to the gym, or maybe I'll go hang out with my friends, and it was all right. So, in my experience, anyway, microdosing does present a safer alternative than flood dosing. And you can literally detox yourself slowly and gradually across a broad span of time. And in my own personal experience, I have not encountered adverse events with microdosing ibogaine, but that does not mean they don't exist. I have heard multiple individuals whom I trust express that, yes, this person had problems from microdosing, and all the basic medical prerequisites still apply. You should get an EKG, you should have a basic blood panel, you should have your liver function checked. You need roughly 1/3 of your liver going. If you have active hep C, then don't do it at that moment in time. But in my opinion, yeah, microdosing is a very interesting phenomenon that is growing rapidly at this point. However, there's a complete lack of any clinical research that has happened with it to date.
My understanding was ICEERS is doing some research around using titrated dosing.
Yes, ICEERS is. They're working with Bruno on that. that's been, and
Yeah. I'd say also from kind of the policy perspective, I think that also presents something that a lot of people who might have a lot of fear around this process can understand and feel safer moving forward with.
Yeah, so, and just to kind of summarize some of what was said here, so clearly medicalization can be helpful from a safety perspective. However, the concern about monopolies, and we see this with marijuana, in proposed and past legislations, where the cannabis industry, certain, you have access to having a license to sell marijuana, and I think these same issues will come up with psychedelics, not only ibogaine, and I think it's something to be wary of. At the same time, how do you the DIY? We don't necessarily want to encourage people to go and do ibogaine by themselves, but people will do it, and so I think it would be valuable if there is good harm reduction information around it. And at the same time, though, if we're talking about microdosing here, and maybe there needs to be more research around this to say definitively, but it's possible that there aren't the same sort of complications, safety issues around microdosing. And if that's the case, then do we need these restrictions around having only certain people being allowed to administer ibogaine if it can be given to people in a way that is safe? Do we need them to pay $3,500 to go to a medical clinic?
So two things to say about medicalization. I am actually not a big fan of bureaucracy or doctors treating you like mommy and daddy. And even, I'm from the United States, so I have to pay a ridiculous amount of money just to get health care. And then it's just anything that I want to do is denied because we don't have any health care. We actually have sick care. Once you get this illness, they will do X, Y, and Z based on your blood work. In order to actually get effective treatment within the United States, you have to go through privatized medicine and pay for it because your doctor works for you, not for your insurance company, and not for the pharmaceutical company. And anyway, with medicalization, two things. Number one, the problem is if medicalization does not occur, the world of ibogaine is getting smaller and smaller, country by country. When an adverse event occurs and it hits the media or the health department responsible for it notices it, they tend to react with hysteria and they tend to ban it. The number of countries that had banned ibogaine back 15 or 20 years ago was basically, well, the United States, of course, and very few other places. That list has grown considerably. Within the European Union, it is mostly allowed or ignored right now, but Italy recently shut it down. And well, France did that a while ago. I think it's been like 12 years, 11 years. But basically, if you don't have medicalization, what you wind up with are governments who just add it to a scheduled substances list, and it becomes impossible to work with it. And number two, without any regulatory frameworks to govern what ibogaine treatment clinics do, are you going to a medically based ibogaine treatment clinic, or are you going to some guy's house who hands you some capsules and there's a bed and nobody knows what they're doing? There's no regulation whatsoever, and there are no consequences to doing that, which opens the door to a lot of bad actors to provide unsafe treatments. So those are two facets that are helped tremendously by medicalization. As far as the underground, is it a good idea to self-dose with ibogaine? No. But people are going to do it anyway, and it's their right to do so, in my opinion.
Okay, yeah, so I think we can do questions. All right, you got a quick one?
Concisely, I'm going to ask you about two ideas and what your response is to your problem. We've been talking about the problem of the creeping criminalization, right? One, what about the medical marijuana movement? Marijuana was illegal if we get up a movement and we have protests in the streets and we say withholding ibogaine from addicts in the middle of a fentanyl epidemic is morally equivalent to taking away babies at the border. It's very distressing, and we have to protest, and we are going to go out there and provide ibogaine anyway, a la Dimitri in Seattle, right? And get busted and take it to court. That's number one. The other alternative, how about getting ibogaine established in every country that allows it in such a way that it is firmly established, as presumably it's going to be in Portugal?
Thanks, Dana. Our first question about comparing it to medical cannabis. I think one really huge difference we have to keep in mind is how accessible cannabis is to people, even when it was illegal, and how many people have personal experiences with cannabis that are not really available with ibogaine in terms of like coming to the streets and demanding change. I still think we should, that it was great to do that as well, but I think that it would have a different community of support. Unfortunately, it's a lot smaller in terms because of all of that access reasons that we're discussing. But I certainly agree. It is really urgent, and we need to be demanding that people pay more attention. But I will say another interesting piece is that in the U.S. there are 3 different states, Vermont, New York, and Maryland, that have introduced, not passed, but there have been even Republican state senators who've introduced ibogaine research legislation. And there's the only psychedelic legislation that's ever been introduced at a state level like that from senators, and I'm pretty confident it's because they know very little. They don't associate ibogaine with some of the other psychedelics in some way. Oh, maybe they see the urgency. You're right. Absolutely. And they see the urgency and the horrible crisis. Absolutely. Totally. But so I think that's something to keep in mind. You're right. They absolutely see the urgency. But it has been interesting to see how that's served ibogaine in different contexts.
I mean, I don't track these things that closely, but the state level efforts in the states so far have been, they seem to be a little bit, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they seem to have been a little bit lackadaisical. Like, yeah, there's some random state senator who comes, gets badgered by, grieving parents, some overdose of some significant family in state X or Y, Vermont or wherever. This is basically what's happened with the three states so far. And so, yeah.
Vermont and Maryland, what? New York.
Yeah, New York. So what you haven't had.
I'm sure you've done a lot of work.
Yeah. What you haven't had really is a groundswell of like grassroots activism, like informing the senators so that they're actually better informed to have better quality arguments about these things. So the hearing that took place most recently, which was it was in Annapolis. I wasn't there, you were there, but was it a high quality discussion? Was there informed discussion in that chamber? Okay, what does that mean?
Everything you said earlier about defamation is true.
Anyway, Dana, just you're focusing on the United States. In my opinion, that is how.
The other question is about Nepal.
Just focusing on the United States and cannabis, I actually believe that is how ibogaine will make it through in the United States. State by state, one of these bills will eventually actually work. They'll stop shooting everything down. One of them will pass. You will have one state with a pilot study that tries ibogaine. Then you'll have 2. Then you'll have 5. Then you'll have 10. And right now, you can basically legally smoke weed in more than half of the United States, and it's still a Schedule I substance. So this is just my opinion.
I want to say I didn't mean to discourage, activism, and I think that's certainly essential, and that nothing can change without that. And I would love to see, like, these groups that are developing of peer support networks for integration and people that have experienced healing from ibogaine to be kind of moving that movement forward. But I know that is not, it takes up a lot of time, and it's a very it's difficult to find time to build that in, and a lot of people that are struggling to maintain their experience don't always have the time to spend doing that, but I would love to keep working with you to change that.
Do we have other questions from the audience? And okay.
Hi. Yeah, I have a question around the current ethical sustainability problem. Just to emphasize my point where I'm coming from. I was in Gabon recently, and while I was there, a friend of mine wanted to experience a traditional ceremony, so he went out into the forest with the Babongo village, and he was told that he'd have maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 spoons, and that would be supplemented with glasses of whiskey, which is just insane, man. And the problem was the area around the public domain where they would traditionally source their iboga for their traditional work for generations has been wiped out by poachers with JCBs to supply the ibogaine clinics. So while I was there was a lot of talk and discussions about manipulating the genes and about soil conditions in Mexico, Hawaii, Australia, all these projects. And what I'm hearing from Gabon is that none of these projects are taking off, and the alkaloids will not grow if it's not in that region of Central Africa. Do you guys know anything about McKenna's work or anybody's work doing this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I spoke about this in my my talk earlier. So a lot of the good iboga has been ripped up, and the trees have been killed. Basically, you know, you can sustainably farm iboga trees by just taking so much of the bark and not uprooting the whole tree with a JCB. But that's what's been happening, and I kind of know too much about that. I've studied that, and I know the particular characters involved in the supply chain, and there's a whole political economy around Gabon and iboga as well. So it's not just a kind of dodgy Western supply chain. It's also Gabonese politics. It's a complex, I only know little bits about it, but what I know is there's a lot of resistance to iboga and Weate in Gabon. So for instance, the iboga law that they're trying to have at the moment, the resistance is partly coming from evangelical Christians who are embarrassed and ashamed about the idea of Gabon being associated with some native traditional thing like that. So they're resisting an iboga law. And then the people around the president is pro an iboga law, I'm told. Almost from the horse's mouth, that is. But the people around the president are making a lot of money from the smuggling. Very powerful people, and they make a lot of money. So it's not evil Westerners so much as it's a complicated internal situation in Gabon. Anyway, the solution to this is not to focus on Tabananthe iboga, it's to make ibogaine from other trees and other shrubs, right? And so we were talking about one particular company earlier, which is doing the work in Brazil. They make their ibogaine from Vocanga africana. So there's 2 leading suppliers of like non-Tabananthe iboga ibogaine. Both use Vocanga africana. One of them is one company, Phytostan, and the other is a Cape Town-based company. It's a bit more of a process to make ibogaine. There's a whole discussion you can have about whether ibogaine is as effective as a total alkaloid or a purified total alkaloid, and the entourage effects of ibogamine in particular and the way it interacts with ibogaine. It's early days for me, but from my experience, again, with talking to lots of people, is ibogaine HCl hydrochloride is fine for an addiction reboot. It's maybe not as visionary and spiritually empowering experience as total alkaloid or purified total alkaloid, but it's fine and it does the job. And the good news is that Vocanga africana is not an endangered plant. It's found across West Africa, and it's not endemic. Like, it does look like Tabananthe iboga is endemic to the Congo Basin. Certain plants just are endemic. They're only found where they are found in the world. Is not a unique thing about Tabananthe iboga. There's many, many plants that are endemic. but Vocanga africana is not endemic, and it can be grown in different places. There is about at least 30 plants which produce ibogaine, probably a lot more. Tabernet montana, different species of Tabernet montana produce ibogaine, for instance, and that Tabernet montana is found around the world. Tabernet montana is found in South America in abundance, and so on. So there were attempts to use like a transgenic approach to producing ibogaine through hairy root technology, but it looks like that project has died a death because it's just simply too expensive a procedure. But yeah, sustainable ibogaine needs to begin with a non-Tabernanthe iboga approach, basically. And what's going to happen likely is I predict that there will be an iboga law in Gabon. That will be a good thing in a way, but what's going to happen is it will mean that the door opens to private plantations. The private plantation business will take over. At least, hopefully, that will protect the remaining public stocks of iboga to be a little bit protected. The ideal situation is you have privatized plantations which have a mandatory by law community social responsibility element to also fund public domain iboga plantations.
Yeah, I get a tangent sort of. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question to you. How did you perceive it? Is the Iboga tabernante actually really disappearing? Because I have heard from 3 different sources, all very reliable sources, that it's actually not disappearing, that this was a lie. And this guy who put the lie out there that it's really endangered is selling himself ibogaine and put the prices quite high up. So do you have any actual picture of the situation? Is it really... This is the guy I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, well, certainly something that I came across when we were researching our series in the magazine was there are different perspectives on sustainability or not, and I certainly don't know the answer to this question personally. But yeah, that's something that was consistent throughout a lot of the questions around ibogaine, not only about sustainability, but a lot of the questions. There are a lot of disagreements. There's a lot that's not known, and that's why I think having these kind of like conversations is really important, so we can really get into this stuff. And actually, another question I had coming off of what Jeremy was saying. I think this is a fair question to ask. Ibogaine versus iboga. So yeah, obviously you can take ibogaine and you will have an effect. But similarly, say psilocybin, analogous to the mushroom, or THC to cannabis, and of course you can smoke THC or you can take psilocybin, but yeah, it seems to be the case that there is more to cannabis than just the THC, and I think there's open questions here. Is it the psilocybin, or are we missing something really important with the whole mushroom? Is it just the ibogaine, or are we missing something really important with the whole iboga? And Patrick wants to say something.
Yeah, just to mention that ibogaine does not work for benzodiazepines. In fact, it's an inverse agonist to GABA receptors. It does nothing. However, various forms of PTA or TA do have some efficacy for benzodiazepines. In particular, the Indra extract, as it was called, had the very interesting side effect of significantly decreasing benzo tolerance. So, I mean, the purer the ibogaine you're using, like ibogaine hydrochloride, if you get, if you're using like the phytostan materials, they do the reboot. They're very effective. You need roughly 30 to 35% more materials than you would from Tabernanthe iboga-derived hydrochloride to accomplish the same thing. You trip less, and it's more like just getting nuked with the materials. When you take PTA or TA, you have much richer visuals, a greater immersion in this whole kind of experience, and some of the other alkaloids in there may very well, and probably do from anecdotal observations, have other anti-addictive properties. It's just at the present time we have no idea what those might be because none of it has been studied.
You mentioned benzos, so that brings up another question for me. I bet you do. So there was an unfortunate adverse event recently with someone who many of us here know, and someone died with the complications related to benzos. And as I was trying to figure out, this person was included in the iBegain series that we ran, and so I went, as out of journalistic responsibility, I wanted to figure out what to say about this, how to give the proper just acknowledgement of whatever happened. And as I was asking people in the iBegain community about this circumstance, I was really surprised to find that there was not even an agreement about what happened in the situation. The official autopsy came back and said that, I'm trying to make sure I got this straight here, the autopsy said that it was an overdose from benzos, with the explanation, so I can see Toby's got a face here, the explanation for that being that the iBegain potentiated the benzos, and therefore the amount of benzos, he had taken benzos shortly before his session, and so the amount that he had taken was now an overdose because it was potentiated by the iBegain. Meanwhile, instead of really shaking your heads here, other folks in the iBegain community are saying it's the exact opposite. The iBegain was actually blocking the benzos, and he actually got withdrawal because of the iBegain here. And I was hearing from people in the iBegain community falling on both sides of this. Some people saying, oh, it was withdrawal. Some saying, oh, it was an overdose, which are obviously the complete opposite sides of the spectrum here. And which to me said, like, there's a lot that's not even understood about iBegain, in particular how it's related to treating people with benzo addiction. Would any of you like to share any comments around this this subject?
I don't think we'll ever know. I fall on the withdrawal side of the spectrum. Just from what I've heard from the owner of the clinic. But that's another thing that we haven't talked about in terms of safety is you can't trust what addicts tell you when they come to the clinic. You have to make sure that they don't bring anything in with them. And in this case, I think there may have been a failure of the screening process such that the person involved who died had benzos on him. So it wasn't clear, was he taking too many benzos? Was he not taking enough benzos? But it's a real problem, especially now with fentanyl. It's like, how do you screen exactly what somebody brings to the clinic with you? And you're taking a bit of a risk, especially with fentanyl being such a minutely powerful substance. So it's the introduction of fentanyl into sort of the heroin sort of supply chain has just added a new layer of risk for providers and clinic owners in the last couple of years.
Yeah, this is really short. You can also utilize cell culture technology, which essentially amounts to you clone iBegain and you push the fast forward button. There you go, infinite iBegain. The problem is it comes in at a price point of roughly, $650 to $800 per gram, which is significantly more expensive than what people are doing right now.
I would like to ask, at the beginning, Jeremy told us that pygmies are using ibogaine for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years, right? So I wonder if it is possible that they are that high because of ibogaine.
I don't know. There's conjecture about. This is kind of off topic, but there's a whole potential link between pharaonic Egypt and the short people that are mentioned in pharaonic texts, and the fact that some of these pygmy tribes are originated from the Upper Nile region, but it's completely off topic. But there was certainly scriptural veneration of these small people in pharaonic texts, and pharaonic Egypt was on the Nile. So there's a speculative, far from proven link between pharaonic Egypt and shamans of Iboga. I don't know. Forest-dwelling people and nutrition and stunting, I'm not sure. It might be that they just simply didn't have enough nutrition, right? and they were stunted. I don't know.
Or they adapted to their region. Maybe there's nothing wrong with their height. It probably works for their life.
It might not help being tall living in lots of trees.
Other questions from the audience? I can probably make some up also. Let's see.
So I want to ask Natalie, what's MAPS's plan for ibogaine going forwards?
We have, right now we really are focused on MDMA approval for both by the EMA and the FDA. But Rick and we definitely are thinking of after MDMA is approved of what substance to take through this process afterward, and ibogaine definitely is being considered. I think for many of the reasons we discussed earlier, it will require a lot of serious consideration about how to approach that. But the needs that we're responding to are also those that we addressed earlier, like insurance coverage. And even we just had a meeting with the EMA about our MDMA studies, and they're also interested in lowering costs so they can possibly support the work. And for people to have access, we do need buy-in from insurance or from government systems. So in that way, I think it could be a really important next step. And I guess that's what we're supporting. We also do research that are more observational studies, so not in this drug development medicalization pathway, but just understanding the results that are going on right now. And I think we plan to continue supporting that as well. Does that about answer? And I guess also on the policy front, it's something that's really a priority to be addressing the barriers to ibogaine access. As you say, ibogaine's getting criminalized in more and more countries, which is not the case with most other substances, the direction it's moving, so it certainly requires attention there.
So if there aren't is there another question from the audience? If there not, I'll leave one parting question for our panelists here, which is just, do you have any final thoughts you want to offer to summarize anything here, or additional things that we didn't cover? What should people watching come away with or think about after this?
I can say I know that we were discussing a lot of the difficulties in access and cost and all of these things. And I know my question earlier about smaller doses kind of might have led or indicated this, but I'm definitely really interested to see how that might help address some of these issues. And I would love to see more research around that and kind of conversation around most effective ways of using smaller doses, or maybe integrating those doses as part of, I understand there might be necessary to also use bigger doses, but just seeing other models we can develop that might be more cost effective and change accessibility, because this really is a really important medicine for that is really not able to be accessed.
Okay, so I'll leave with one parting thought here. We were talking a lot about medicalization and the pros and cons of all of this, and versus the DIY method and the risks of that, right? And I would maybe put out a thought that maybe there's a middle way here. Maybe there is a way that we can create a medicalization model that is safe and gives people access, and simultaneously decriminalize other aspects of ibogaine, so that people who maybe don't have access to that medical framework, but choose to take the risk at their own risk, at least won't have the additional problems associated with the drug war if they choose to use ibogaine in any different context. So I'll just leave that parting thought with you. And thank you to everyone in this panel. Thank you all for being here.